Live from the Glasgow Electric Plant Board, Glasgow Wants to Know. With your host, Mr. Uhel Barrickman.
To another edition of Glasgow Wants to Know. I would remind you once again that in the event you have questions as a result of our discussion here tonight, or have anything you want to ask our guests, please call 651-8341. And our guest again tonight is the well-known local historian, Jimmy Simmons. We had a discussion with him on local and Barron County history a month ago, and we're going to continue it tonight. Last month, Jimmy, we were talking about at one time the Spanish-American War and the contributions that were made in that conflict by people from this county, and you mentioned that in addition to the company that was raised and used, that a black company was raised here. Can you elaborate more on that, and do you know the names of any of the people that were in it?
It was called the Moss Manier Guards, and this, I think Moss and Manier were lawyers here, and they were instrumental in raising this company, but the officers were Civil War veterans. One of the officers was an Alexander. I forgot what he was. I want to say Jack Alexander. I do have them, the list of the officers, so I don't have the list of the men. But there was an article that appeared, I think, in the Glasgow Republican right after Memorial Day last year, in which it said that the Moss Manier Guards took an active part in the Memorial Day commemoration and were quite evident by their number. And they, of course, were never mustered in. They were organized and everything, but we never had nearly. We only had 3 regiments and 2 companies of cavalry that went to the Spanish-American War from Kentucky as far as Kentucky Straight troops were concerned, and they didn't call this black company. But yeah, that may have had something to do with the fact that there was some agitation. Some people wanted the officers in these black companies to be white, and I know the Republican at that time had an article in there which said that it thought and that was in the days when volunteers elected their own officers. It thought that they had the right to elect their own officers. If they wanted to have black officers, that would be fine. I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or not, but there was this article was in the same paper as the one about the Moss Manier Guards taking part in the Memorial Day services. And I haven't found any more about them. I wish I had a roster of them. I'd give my teeth for it, to tell you the truth.
Well, now you raise another issue and a question that I will ask you. I have read histories of the bar of Barron County, but I haven't seen anything in any history I've read that indicates that there's ever been any black lawyers in Barron and Glasgow County, and yet, if I understood you correctly, possibly two of the officers and the main leaders in raising this black company were lawyers.
They were white officers. They were white lawyers, I mean.
They were white lawyers,
white
not
lawyers.
Black lawyers.
If we ever had a black lawyer, I don't know who it was, but now we did have a black doctor here. And I don't remember what his name was offhand. He appeared in the 1912 City Directory, I believe it was. We did have a black doctor here, I know that. But if we ever had any black lawyers, I never heard of them.
I've never heard of any black lawyers.
No.
And to be honest about it, I have wondered why in recent times we haven't had a black lawyer here.
They don't, they go where I guess there's more opportunity in the city. For instance, one of the Merles, one of George Merle's sons, is a lawyer, and I can't remember whether he's in Louisville or he had a son that was a dentist, and maybe he was in Louisville. But I think one of his children was a lawyer. And then Jesse Crenshaw.
I know Jesse. He's in Lexington.
Jesse Crenshaw, was an interpreter in the Vietnamese War. He was an interpreter in Vietnamese, and I think they're doing right well where they are, but they haven't come back here.
I know Jesse and his mother both, and I think Jesse's doing right well in Lexington. I know that's where he's practicing.
he impressed me from the. I met him a few times, and I was very impressed by him as, having a lot on the ball, it seemed to me.
Of course, there's been considerable emphasis placed on Fort Williams here within the last few years. Tell us some more about Fort Williams.
Well, I'll give you a little bit more background. And of course, Glasgow had one of the 3 Confederate post offices in the state of Kentucky, so you can see sort of where the town leaned. Although the county was spotty, it was divided up. And we didn't have very large troop concentration camps here. We did have, up until they evacuated Kentucky before the Battle of Shiloh, we had Benjamin Hardin Helm, who you probably know was Abraham Lincoln's brother-in-law. His regiment, Confederate regiment, was here, and they, when they evacuated Bowling Green in February of 1862, they also, of course, gave up Glasgow when they burned the bridge over the Barren River down here. And then for a good many months, we didn't have any troops here. We'd have some pass through. But we were having trouble with guerrillas and things like that. And finally, in the fall of 1862, Braxton Bragg invaded Kentucky, and he came to Barren County and scared the fire out of a lot of people here, because they were afraid that he was going to burn the mills and things. He did not, but he did keep them working 24 hours a day. But that scared the North so much that they decided to put a garrison here. And that was the reason they built Fort Williams. And we were having so much guerrilla trouble. Well, from Glasgow to Nashville was a no man's land. You really had some bad actors down through there. And so what they would do was they established a number of, I guess you'd call them bases, forts like Fort William. And from there, they sent patrols out into these border counties of Kentucky and Tennessee to try to catch these guerrillas. And of course, they had organized the 37th Kentucky Mounted Infantry. Major Sam Martin, who had been with the 5th Kentucky Cavalry, Union Cavalry, started to organize this regiment here. This was the only unit that was organized in Glasgow during the Civil War on either side. Now, you did have some Confederate units organized in Cave City, but this was the only one that was mustered in Glasgow. Mostly were boys. I have a picture of one of the companies, and A company was Captain Isaac Newton Chenoweth, who was a first cousin of my grandmother's, and he hailed from the 88 neighborhood, the old Sarton precinct. And these boys that were in this company, mostly were 15, 16, 17-year-old boys, all worn-out veterans, one or the other, and they were just in the process of being organized and trained when, in October of 1863, Colonel John Hughes, who was a Tennessean from, I think, maybe Jackson County, but just across the line over there, he was sent into that section to recruit. And he was supposed to get deserters and people who were cut off and couldn't get back and everything, and get them back to the Confederate Army. Well, he found out that was impossible because that was in the Union lines. He decided to come up here and attack the fort. And that was the major fight that we had in Glasgow. Now, we'd had a little skirmish here at Christmas of 1862. John Hunt Morgan and the Michigan Cavalry fought here. But we never had, this was a pretty fair fight. I mean, we had a number of people killed on both sides about this time. And they had, the headquarters was downtown at the courthouse, and the fort, of course, is where it is now. And they camped within the cemetery, where the cemetery is now. And so anyway, they came through town early one morning before daylight. Martin was sick, and he was awake, and he when these troops came through, they had a company out that they thought had not reported back in yet. Well, they hadn't, for that matter. And instead of reporting back in to the headquarters, they went on up to the fort. So they thought this bunch of horsemen that came riding into town about daylight were Union soldiers. They weren't. And they had a sort of a Western-type shootout down there. Major Martin and Captain Chenoweth and 2 or 3 others shot their way to the stables, and they got their horses and rode up to war on the fort, but it was too late. When they got up there, they saw that they had already started to line up the prisoners. And they started up the railroad track or the railroad right-of-way to Cave City, and they got reinforcements. And they came back, and they chased them all night to Tompkinsville. And when they got over to Tompkinsville, they found out that most of the men had dropped out along the way. But they did recover the guns and things that Hughes had captured. But it remained a garrison for the rest of the war. And the thing that always fascinated me about it was when they did this research on the fort up there when they went to get a government grant for it. One of the things that they did, they found a series of letters in the National Archives, and one of these soldiers from, I believe, the 5th Indiana Cavalry said when they marched into town it was raining, and said as they went up through there was an old man followed them up to the fort, and he came in and told them how glad he was to see the old flag. Said he had followed it during the American Revolution, and he had followed it during the War of 1812, but he didn't tell who he was. But that would have made him over 100 years old, and I would really like to know who that was.
Yes, that would have been really something to have known who that was.
I think at that time they claimed that there were 5 revolutionary soldiers still alive in the whole United States when the American Civil War was fought, and he wasn't one of the 5 because they were all from New England.
Again, I would remind the listening audience that we would welcome questions about local history, and if you have a question, please call 651-8341, and we'll be glad to have Mr. Simmons answer it. A part of Barron County history, as I understand it, revolved around Bell's Tavern. What do you know about Bell's Tavern, and tell the audience about its location?
Well, Bell's Tavern was a popular, I guess, stage stop, you could say it was, and it was a restaurant, hotel, you know, tavern, the whole bit. It was, let's see, it's on this side of the railroad track. If you know Park City, there's a road that goes, I think, from Bon Air out here, somewhere in there. All right, when it comes out into the old Dixie Highway, there is a feed plant or something there. You know, they got, I don't know if it's Purina who it is, don't remember. But anyway, right on to the right, if you're going from this direction, right to the right of there in the woods is the remains of Bell's Tavern. Now, Bell's Tavern burned sometime before the Civil War, and they started to rebuild it. And they built it out of stone, and there's this massive stone structure there, you know, that's about a story high that's still there. There's also a very old cemetery there that has a number of Civil War soldiers in it, both north and south. And this was a place where during the early part of the war, John Hunt Morgan's men captured. They camped there, I mean. And Bell's Tavern, there was no Park City, there was no Glasgow Junction. It was called Bell's Tavern. And the interesting thing, in the census records, it had a number of people that lived there who were Irishmen, and they were listed as gardeners because they raised the vegetables and things. They fed people there. And when the war came along, the two Bell boys, now the lady who ran the thing, she was a widow. Her husband had died. I can't remember her name offhand, but she had 2 sons, and both of them joined Morgan's cavalry. And one of them rose to the rank of captain in Breckinridge's regiment. And of course, the Civil War stopped the building, and it never was completed. But you can still see the thing there. It's quite a massive, big stones and things, big basement, and foundation. Oh, probably maybe as high as first story.
Well, I've heard that President Andrew Jackson had stayed or stopped there maybe more than once on his way from Nashville to Washington.
He may have, but of course Jackson was like George Washington. He slept everywhere. If he'd slept everywhere that they said he did, he'd spent most of his time sleeping, I think. It is a fact that he did, on his way to Washington one time, come up this highway here. The fact that the Jackson Highway was named for him, 31E. And Uncle Cyrus Edwards, you know, tells the story of how old General Forbes, who wasn't a general, at least he might have been in the militia before it was over, but during the Revolution he was a private. But as the years went by, some of those old timers, you know, got promoted each year in their minds, you know. Well, he used to round up all the veterans of the War of 1812 and the American Revolution, and they would stand out there and present arms when Jackson went through, you know, and then Jackson would get off and inspect them. And Uncle Cyrus in his book tells quite an interesting story about that. But he very well could have.
Why don't you tell a little more about Uncle Cyrus?
Well, Uncle Cyrus Edwards, Hart County claims him, and we do too. And of course, he was everybody's uncle, you know. I don't know. He had some nieces and nephews. Some people here in Glasgow might remember Robert Pointer, who was his great-grandson. He was an accountant here, you know, and died a few years back. And his daughter, who was Robert's grandmother, was Florence Edwards. She married a gardener, and she lived to be quite old. The Edwards, you know, live forever. You know, they really have their heredity is that they have long longevity. And he had a mind like a steel trap. And he was brought up in the Hinesville area. He lived in Hart County some. Well, later he lived in Hart County for sure, but in the Barron and Hart County area. And when the Civil War came along, he was about 15 or 16, but he joined the Army, and he stayed in until the war was over. And about the time World War II started in Europe, he wrote a letter, I believe, to the Courier Journal, which is one of the greatest patriotic letters that I've ever seen. But he knew just about everybody and everything that ever took part in that country over there, took place in that country over there. He was the one who wrote up the article on the cholera epidemic here in Glasgow.
That was in about 1850.
1854, I believe, was. In fact, his father was in the hotel that night when that circus performer came down with it, and that was the one that also killed Sam Fowler, the town, I guess you'd say, comedian, because he was always had something going for him. But Uncle Cyrus was quite a person. He was a patriot, and you know, for years he was a surveyor. He went west and surveyed. He had quite a colorful life. I wish I'd have known him. I didn't, but I wish I had. I feel like I did, but I didn't.
Well, now suppose you talk a little bit about the comedian Fowler.
Well, Sam, he was highly respected because every once in a while in going through old census and tax records and things, you'll find somebody named Samuel Fowler so-and-so, you know, because you knew who they were named for. And he lived in a house that you probably, it was still standing when you moved to Glasgow, but you know what, where Columbia and Front and Broadway run together. You remember the big old, sort of a 3-story brick painted white, belonged to Bill McEwen, I believe. And that house, of course, was built a good while before the Civil War. It happened, by the way, that was General Bragg's headquarters when he was in Glasgow. And that was the one where somebody had dropped a $5 gold piece and it ran through a crack in the floor. And when they tore it down to build that service station, everybody was on the lookout for it. But they didn't find it. I don't know what happened to it. They didn't find it. But Sam Fowler put out the word. He was always doing something like this. But Sam Fowler put out the word that he had invented a flying costume with wings. From the description of it, it reminds me of what we think about a Batman looks like, you know. When he put the word out, well, people came from everywhere, and they sold tickets. And they came here, well, they came from Cumberland County and everywhere around, you know, to see him fly off the roof. Of course, that was probably it was at that time the highest building in Glasgow, and he was going to fly off that roof. And of course, the appointed day and the appointed hour arrives, and the town is full, and everybody's giving whatever they charged them for this showing. He walks up on the edge of the roof, dressed up in this Batman-like costume, and waves to the crowd. And then he backs off to get a running start. Well, of course, all of a sudden here he comes out over the edge of the roof, you know, the wings collapse, and down he goes 3 stories to the floor below in a heap. Well, everybody first was horrified, and they jumped back, and then, of course, they ran up to see. Well, when they got up there, it was a dummy. Well, then they got unhappy about it, and so they decided that he needed hanging. And so somebody got a rope, and they started looking for him, but he wasn't anywhere to be found. Finally, somebody located him in this same tavern that stood where the Beulah Nun Park is now. And they located him up there with some of his friends at the bar drinking and joking about it. So they went and got him and took him out to hang him. And he said, could he say some last words? And they said, well, yeah, they thought anybody was entitled to a few last words. He said, I just want to ask you a question. So what's that? Said, well, did you think that was me that came off that roof up there? And they said, yes, they thought it was him. They said, did you really think I could fly? No, they didn't think he could fly. They said, in other words, you thought I'd be killed. And they said, yes, they did. And everything said, okay. Says, you had the same thrill when it hit the ground. You thought it was me, and you had the same thrill as if it had been me. And says, I'm still alive. And so they ended up there, belted up to the bar with him, drinking and laughing about it too. He was always pulling something like that, I understand. He died in the cholera epidemic, incidentally.
So this took place before the Civil War?
This took place before 1804. I'd say that was about 1850 probably, because he died in the cholera epidemic. And I believe that was 54. It was either 52 or 54.
Going back to Andy Jackson, did Barron County supply any men for his force when he invaded New Orleans?
Yes, we had one company, Captain Malone, who actually was, today he was from Metcalfe County, but you have to remember, of course, that Barron County was much larger then. He sent a company, but we sent a company down there, and they were involved in that controversy over weapons because they had been told that they would be given weapons when they got to New Orleans. And some of the Kentuckians were furnished with weapons and some were not. And we have tried and tried and tried, 2 or 3 people, myself, to pin down whether or not the company from Glasgow actually fought. And the only pension records that I've ever found, they say, well, they were at the Battle of New Orleans. But I want somebody to say, you know, well, I fought there. They went down by a riverboat. I would say, from the way things were then, they probably went to Burkesville. And from there, they got on flatboats, floated to Cumberland into the Ohio, and the Ohio and the Mississippi down to New Orleans. And but they certainly were there. And we did have a company from here that went there, which would have roughly be 100 men. Now, we had another company in the Battle of the Thames, which was when Tecumseh was killed and skinned, you know.
Yeah, I know, but I doubt that a large part of the audience knows where the Battle of the Thames took place and when. Okay,
it was in Canada. We when the War of 1812 started, you know, the battle cry of the whole United States, just about, particularly Kentucky, was on to Canada. And we sent troops up there, and roughly where Monroe, Michigan is now, there was a place called Frenchtown. And there's an old French settlement there. And they got there, well, they'd been out campaigning all summer long, and their clothes were in rags, and the winter was cold, and they had blankets wrapped around them, so like a kilt to try to keep warm. And they fought the British and the Indians there, and General Winchester, who was from our neighboring state of Tennessee down here, his headquarters wasn't on the battlefield, and then he decided he had to go check on something about the time that the British and the Indians got there, and they left he left a gap in his lines. And of course they had a very bitter fight the next day, and all that cold and everything, and the Kentuckians, of course, were sort of wild men anyway, but they when they saw the Indians and the British fired cannons at them with solid shot, and they just hit and rolled on the ground, and so they got to crowing like roosters and barking like dogs, you know. And anyway, they had the fight, and the regular troops and things didn't do too well, but the Kentuckians did pretty well. In fact, when this officer came out with the flag of truce, happened to be an American officer that the British had captured and sent out, when they came out with this flag of truce, they thought that the British wanted to surrender to them. But he wanted them to surrender. Well, they finally agreed to surrender on the condition that they would be protected from the Indians. Well, they left the wounded there at Frenchtown, and they left guards to guard them. But then all of a sudden they had Indians all over them everywhere, and so the British guards went off and left them. And the Indians slaughtered those people. They dragged them off of sleds and tomahawked them, and then they took their heads and stuck them up. They had the prisoners that the British had marched to Detroit. They had them in a sort of a cattle pen, and they stuck the heads of these Kentuckians up on these posts and things. And well, you can imagine how that went over back in Kentucky when they found out about it. So Governor Isaac Shelby, who was a fighter, old Indian fighter, and fought the British and everything else, I sometimes think this may be the reason that in our Constitution we have this thing that says that if you are the governor of the Commonwealth and you leave the state, you don't have any power. You know, the lieutenant governor or on down the line inherits that power. And I sort of wonder sometimes if this isn't the reason for this, because his advertisements were, I need 10,000 volunteers. Come and I will lead you. And that's what he did. And so they marched north. They crossed into Canada, went to the Thames River, which is in southern Ontario, and there they met the British and the Indians, and they supposedly killed Tecumseh there. Now there's, you know, it's like everything else, you know. Some people say, well, Tecumseh got away and died of old age somewhere else, you know, but I don't think he did. But Tecumseh had told his men that he could not be killed, and said that if he was shot down, that somebody was to take a ramrod and run and hit his body 3 times, and he'd get back up and go to fighting again. And so he had one of his chiefs was named Thumper, and when Tecumseh fell, Thumper ran out and hit him with the ramrod 3 times, but he didn't get up. And incidentally, the man who was given credit for killing him later on became Vice President of the United States, Vice President Johnson, you know, Richard Mentor Johnson, who was the only vice president we ever had elected by the United States Senate. And he was known for his foul mouth and a couple other things, but he was a fighter. And he was supposedly he was the one who killed Tecumseh. Now, the one that should have been killed was Tecumseh's brother, the prophet, but he got away and he did live to a ripe old age. But poor old Tecumseh, he didn't fare too well at the hands of the Kentuckians because they skinned him. And they brought his skin back and made wallets and souvenirs for their girlfriends. I can imagine that'd be a real thrill for your boyfriend to come back and give you something made out of Tecumseh's skin. But it was a decisive battle for that time up there. Probably was more decisive with the Battle of New Orleans because, of course, the war was over when the Battle of New Orleans was fought.
I remind the audience once again that if you have questions for Mr. Simmons, please call 651-8341. He'll be glad to answer them. Since you mentioned about Governor Shelby and raising 10,000 men, or asking for them and raising them, suppose you elaborate a little bit on how militia companies were raised and formed and how they were integrated into federal forces when they were, up to and including the Civil War.
All right. Well, of course, our first military forces from the time that the people came to Jamestown and things were militia. And it's still, if I'm not mistaken, on the books in Kentucky and most other states, because this is the thing that they're able to draft people under. But all able-bodied males between the ages, I believe it's of 18 and 45 in this state, are considered to compose the militia. And they used to have what they called a muster. It was a drill. Once a month, the militia was supposed to get together and drill. You had to furnish your own weapon, and if you could not, you had to swear a pauper's oath, and the state would furnish you a weapon. And the men in a particular neighborhood would form a company, and they elected their own officers. And the officers were responsible for holding these musters. And of course, after the American Revolution and after the Indians quit raiding Kentucky, before the War of 1812, a little while, but when that happened, the militia in Kentucky just got so that when they go to muster, for instance, rather than carry the heavy musket, they'd stop and they'd cut a cornstalk out of the field and they'd go and drill with that. And they've got the nickname of Cornstalk Militia. And it got to be a time of just revelry, you know. I mean, they'd go down there and get to drink in and things like that, you know. And it didn't amount to very much. Of course, when the War of 1812 came along, everybody's pretty shaken. And so instead of the federal government having something like a draft, what they would do, they would send down to Isaac Shelby, for instance, and say, we need some men to go do so-and-so. And they were under state control still. They were under state control. And well, they did recruit for the regulars here in the War of 1812. But there were several companies raised here, and what they would do, they were supposed to have a monthly muster. Normally that was a company muster, about 80 to 100 men. Then every quarter they would have a battalion muster. There'd be 4 or 5 companies. Then once a year they'd have a regimental muster, and that would be in the county seat. We were the 96th, Barron County, I believe, was the 96th Regiment of Kentucky Militia. And we had 1 or 2 fairly high officers from here. Of course, they handed out general's commissions, things fairly easy.
Now, who handed them out?
All the officers were all the field grade officers were commissioned by the governor of the state of Kentucky, and he provided the commissions. And the company grade officers were elected by the men, but they were also commissioned by the state. And so anyway, they finally fell into almost disuse till the Civil War came along, and we started having companies organized, some to go north and some to go south and everything, and they were trying to revive the militia a little bit. And there was a captain out from about Hiceville. They were required by law to report to the county court clerk if they held, or when they held a muster. And in his report, anyway, he said, how was it? He says that it wasn't any point in him holding a muster anymore because he said nobody would come. Most of them would rather pay the 15 cents and stay home. That's what they found at 15 cents.
Again, we remind you that if you have a question, please call in. Oh, you have a question. 2 of them. All right, let's have them.
Okay, Mr. Simmons, as a child growing up, I remember there was a house that was claimed to have been built by George Washington for one of his nieces. Is there any truth to this? It was on East Main Street past Rice's Radio and Television.
You're probably thinking about the one that's on North Ray Street. That was the one that they said was built. That's erroneous. That's all. Of all people to make up that story, there was a Methodist preacher's wife. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she concocted this story, see, about the house. Now, the house now is the one where it's at the corner of Front and North Ray Street. Now, there is an old house, which is very old, by the way. It's probably older than that one is. That is on the Main Street, and that's the one that Delville Grill lives in. It's across the street from that Philco station or whatever it is. That's a very old house. If you see any old pictures, for instance, of the troops that were going from here to, during the First World War, for some reason or other, they always got along there and had their picture made. I think there was a wall, and some of them could stand on it, and some could sit down on it. They could get them all in there. And you'll always see 2 or 3 old Civil War soldiers down there with them, too. They used to come out to see the boys off, you know. But anyway, this house supposedly was built of bricks which were carried here on the backs of horses and mules from Virginia. Now, the fact is that George Washington did have, it was either 3 great nieces or 3 nieces, I forget which now, the Lewis girls. They did come here. One of them, well, Miss Paul Allen's descendant of one of them. One of them was married to a Davidson. One of them was married to a Spotswood. But the Spotswood, they owned that property there on North Ray Street. However, they didn't build any house there. And anyway, if you know that area over there, you know where those bricks came from, because the Brickyard Pond is right behind there, over the hill there behind the jail is the Brickyard Pond. That's where they came from. Well, it had taken every horse and mule in Virginia to bring enough bricks here to build that house. That house was built about 1816 by the Martins, and one of those Martins ended up in Mississippi and became the ranking Confederate general from that state during the Civil War. But they've told lots of tales about it like that. But that's not true. The Spotswoods never lived there. Now, we've had a lot of other people who lived there over the years. I know there's a cave, you know, under there, and there was some old gentleman that lived there. I forgot who it is now. But anyway, he used that as his wine cellar. But there's also a back to that cave over behind the old city jail on Front Street. And there were some of the local boys found out that the old man had his wine stored in there, and they went and relieved him of some of it. And you may have heard the tales in recent years about the Black Panther that was seen going out there. That's been in the last 30, 40 years that people reported seeing a Black Panther going out of that cave. However, when they had that rock quarry back there, they dynamited and they got it blocked off. They don't want people going in it because loose rocks and things. They don't want another Floyd Collins.
What's the second question?
Mr. Simmons? Were there very many Indian raids around the Glasgow area back when Glasgow was first settled? If there were, what tribes were they?
Well, there weren't too many Indian raids things around here. Of course, you know that when the settlers, the Long Hunters first, and Daniel Boone and all those people, when they came into Kentucky, they didn't find any tribes living here as a permanent thing. What you had was the ones from the north, which were the Shawnees, and they were dominated by the Iroquois. They would come down here to hunt and make war, while the Cherokees and some of the Creeks and some of those would come up from the south, and they'd hunt and make war. But we did have sort of families of Indians that wandered around here, and every once in a while somebody will come up with a name or something, you know, that you think, well, that has to mean that something was going on here. For instance, down here, this side of Fountain Run, which is still in Barron County, there's a place down there which is called Defeated Camp Creek. Well, somebody got defeated there, and you know, it had to be somebody that would have recalled it and named it that. And I figured it probably was some of those surveyors or long hunters. But as far as having any pitched battles or anything in here, we did not. We had once in a while somebody would disappear. For instance, if you know the story of Nobob, how it got its name, the story goes that one of the survey party was Edmund Rogers. His name was Bob. I always thought his name was Bob Lynn, but somebody told me thought it was something else. But anyway, he was hunting because they had somebody, they'd take turns hunting and bringing in meat and to the camp. And so when the surveyors got back to camp, they couldn't find him. and they decided that maybe a bear had gotten him or the Indians had gotten him or something, and they went out hunting for him. And when they'd come back, somebody said, well, did you find him? And somebody would say, no, Bob. And that's how No Bob got his name. But No Lynn got his name the same way.
Now that you're into names, do you know, and I've been asked this a lot of times, how you know got its name?
Now, that's one I don't know.
Well,
I don't know how you know got to you know. I don't know how some of these other places did. 88, you know. Or was it old Uncle? Oh, he was a Nunley. Anyway, he was postmaster, and he didn't write very well, but he could make good eights. And actually, that a town it's 2 eights really. Now, if you see the sign up there, it's got 88 spelled out. But Uncle, what was his, Nunley? Anyway, it was just 2 eights is what it was. And I guess you know that when Truman and beat Dewey, they got 88 votes for Dewey and 88 votes for Truman.
Returning to houses, there's another house that on North Race that has some history to it. You talked about the house where Delvo Greer now lives, but this is the Delvo house, which is now owned by the Grays. That has some history. How about talking about that for a little while?
Now, I think of that as the Tom Dickinson house. Now, Tom Dickinson was an early settler here. Well, his father was an early settler here. I guess Tom was probably born here. And he's the ancestor of Dr. Lewis, Dr. John, Henry, Benny, all those Dickinsons. They've always been town people, you know. A lot of people around here came from somewhere else or out in the county, you know, but they've always lived in town since they've been here. And that was the Tom Dickinson place. Tom Dickinson learned, he was apprenticed to a blacksmith, and he learned the blacksmith trade. And as a result of that, he worked hard and saved his money and got into the banking business. Sort of established a family fortune, I guess you'd say. And anyway, he had that house, and during the Civil War, see, that was used as a hospital. I wondered about the floors in there lots of times, you know. If floors weren't finished, and they weren't, most of them that day weren't finished. I don't care how nice the house was, they didn't have any kind of finish on the floor. I had carpets, but, you know, the old folk tale, which I think is probably true, is that blood stains won't come up. You can scrub and scrub and scrub, and it'll be just as white as you can imagine, and then the first time it rains, those blood stains will come back up through the wood again. And I've often wondered if there's any blood in there. And I've always, all my life, have been told that there are Confederate soldiers buried behind that house. Because, you know, when Braxton Bragg was here in '62, after the Battle of Munfordville, we had a number of casualties that were brought back here. And they always had sick men in their armies anyway. And one of them was, of course, the old Beaufort place where Dr. Harvey lived out here on the Jimtown Road. That was a hospital. And that one out there was used as a hospital. It's quite old, and one of the Dickinsons, I think, married into the Delvo family, and I think that's how that got to be known as the Delvo house.
I don't think we mentioned the last time, and we certainly haven't tonight, whether or not there were any toll roads around here. Most people think that toll roads are recent invention, when actually we've had toll roads for many, many years, not only in Kentucky but other places.
They were generally private roads, but if we had any place where you had to pay a toll around here, other than in the days when Hart County, you know, before it was created, you had bridge tolls, or really a ferry toll up there. That still divides that county today from the Barron County part from the LaRue County part. Those people are still mad about having to pay that toll to get into the county seat. But if we had any other toll roads around here, I don't know about them. We probably did, because they were private things, you know. It's like ferries and everything else were private then.
I understand that there had been toll roads here, but I really don't know.
I'm sure there were.
Let's talk a little bit about World War I. What about Barron County's participation in World War I?
We had a good record. Incidentally, one of the last two members of the AEF to leave France was from Glasgow. That was Sam Sears. And Sam Sears before the war had started, he was teaching high school in the state of Washington and coaching football, I believe, out there. And he had the friends that he ran around with out there. Most of them were in the Washington State Guard, which was, of course, what became the National Guard. And they were enlisting to go into the war, and so they said, "Come along, go with us, Sam." And so he joined up and was in the 40th Division. Well, by the time that he got to France with the 40th Division, they were taking such heavy casualties. They decided not to put any new divisions into the line, rather to use them as depot brigades, which we'd called repel-depels, in World War II. And anyway, they started sending these guys to other divisions up there. And Sam always said, "I probably would be dead today if it hadn't been that I could use a typewriter." And so they put him and another sergeant in there to keeping records and things. He said it was awful. Said they had men pass through there that had never fired a weapon. They had men who had one arm and one side, the legs and arms were drawn and stuff. And they sent those men to the front. And he stayed after the war was over, and he and one other sergeant boxed the thing up, boxed all the records up, and they brought him back to Washington, D.C., turned him over to the Secretary of War, and they got discharged and came home. But we we had a few men in the regular Army. Edgar Cowell was a regular Army officer. He lived on South Green Street, and the Cowell house is where Perry Brantley lives now. And he was a regular Army officer. He was in the 1st Division. He had the Distinguished Service Cross and 2 Silver Stars. He was sort of wired together, but he was on one whale of a soldier, I'll tell you that. I can remember him. I don't know, when he counted cadence, he wouldn't say up 2, 3, 4. He'd say Hearn, Hearn, Hearn. I remember hearing him count cadence. But he was very active in the Legion and stuff after the war was over. But anyway, we had others that were in the regular Army. I know Grover Toddy, who I grew up around the corner from. He was in the 1st Division. But most of them went in through the draft or as volunteers during the war. We did not have a National Guard company or troop or anything here during the war. The closest one was in Bowling Green. And in 1916, of course, when they decided to go out to Pancho Villa down the Mexican border, we had a number of people from Glasgow that went down and joined that company down there. William Henry Jones, that used to be the junior, that used to be the editor of the Glasgow Republican, he was one of them. And of course, by the time their year and a half, whatever it was up, we were in the war, and they stayed in for World War II. But we had a number of people. The first ones that were drafted from around here were sent to Camp Taylor. In fact, before it was over, most of them went to Camp Taylor. And the Camp Taylor, of course, was in the outskirts of Louisville. The last time I knew anything about Camp Taylor, they still had, I think, one building out there that was still standing that was there during the war. But you could see why they put one there then. The main transportation, was railroads, and so they could, run the trains out there to it. And that's where so many of them from here died because of the flu epidemic, killed so many there. But the first ones that went in, they formed a division there, which was the 84th Division, better known as the Lincoln Division. And the reason for that was that some of the men came from Indiana, some came from Illinois, and some from Kentucky, which, of course, were the 3 states that Abraham Lincoln was associated with. And they saw quite a bit of action. I know when they decided to change Veterans Day from November the 11th, to October there for a while, and then, of course, they got smart and went back to the 11th, made all the World War I veterans mad. But we had a World War I reunion at the old Flame Room up the Uptowner Motel, and we advertised that this would be the last chance for them to come to a Veterans Day on November the 11th, as far as we knew. Of course, they did go back to it eventually, but at that time we didn't know they were going back. And we had, it was either 11 or 12 men who had served in the same company in France that showed up. They were from the supply company of the 300-something infantry, I forget what it was now, but some of you may remember Jake Williams was one, and Bullen Chapman, and Mr. Henry Ellis, and I know a lot of them. I will never forget that Veterans Day because, and Mr. Henry Ellis had a stroke, and he was, well, it wasn't bedfast, but he was pretty well confined to a wheelchair. And now he came, I remember he had on bedroom slippers and things, and he said, "I just want to be with the boys one more time." And we went down to the courthouse for the program, and it came time for the national anthem, and I asked everybody to come to attention and to salute. And Mr. Ellis got out of that wheelchair and saluted. But as time went along, before the anthem's over, I could see that elbow giving away. He was coming down like that, and it so happened that Carl Huffman was standing right on the right. And I saw him glance out of his eye and saw what was happening. And all of a sudden, his left arm came up and caught Mr. Ellis's arm and held it up till they got through. And it was his last time. He never lived to come to another Veterans Day. But we had men who saw quite a bit of action. We had several people decorated and things from here. I suppose that Herman Stout saw as much action or more than anybody else did from here.
Did we have anybody from here that joined the veterans on the bonus march during the administration of President Hoover?
No, to my knowledge, no. I don't think there were. I believe I would have run across it sometime or the other. It was a bad scene, of course. You know, they tear gassed them and they bayoneted one or two.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't much of a reward for men who had, of course, they didn't have the bonus to pay them, I know that, but, and all, when Franklin Roosevelt got elected, all Franklin did was set up some tents and put some coffee pots out and killed them with kindness. He didn't give them any bonus either. They eventually, you know, did give them out those bonds, you know, but they didn't get any cash. And now they finally got tired and went home.
You have mentioned at least a couple of characters recently here, one being Sam Sears. I'm sure you know the stories about him in football.
They were true too.
What?
They got short of players and things, and so Sam put on uniform and went in. Of course, they didn't have much in the way of uniforms then. Somebody knocked his helmet off, and there was that bald paint shining, you know. But they did. I don't think they did anything about it.
This was about 1920.
Along there in the early days, when they used to sew loops on some of the uniforms. I think Toby Redmond told me that. Said they had loops sewed on the guy that was going to carry the ball. They'd have a loop sewed on his uniform, and they'd get up close and if there was looked like someone was going to tackle him, some of his people would grab him by those loops and throw him over the the tackle so he could make a touchdown. They had some things going here then. They were wild. I know. I ran into a man in Canada one time, and he asked me. I was at a Cub Scout camp. And he asked me where I was from in Kentucky. And I told him that I was from a little town, south of Louisville. That he probably heard. He said, "No, I want to know where you're from." He said, I may have wrestled there. And I said, "Well, it's Glasgow. I've wrestled there many times." And that was in the days when they wrestled in the old ballpark where the Happy Valley Shopping Center is now. And so he said, "I wrestled there one time." Said I was the bad guy, and said those people started rocking me. And if anybody remembers that old ballpark, there's plenty of rocks to pick up and throw. And so he ran up to the sheriff. He said, I ran up to the sheriff, and I said, Sheriff, give him some protection." Said the sheriff looked at me and said, "Yes, O.B., I ought to kill you myself."
We have another question, I think.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Mr. Simmons,
Yes.
I have always heard that Lusker Twyman's grandfather was sold as a slave in the courthouse yard. Is that true?
Probably so. They were.
Tell us about it.
Well, I don't know about that particular sale, but I do know where he was from and who they belonged to out there. They belonged to. We had a family of white Twymans. I don't know if any of them left or not. They lived up on the other side of Hiceville toward the Blue Spring, and they, of course, they owned later on the Lusker Twyman's ancestors' names, and he probably was, but I don't know about that particular sale. I've talked to Lusker a lot about those times and everything, and we don't understand this now, but the white Twymans and the black Twymans and all those families like that, if the black people took the name of the people that owned them, there was a certain bond between them, and they talked about their white folks and stuff. They're just like they were actually blood kin, and indeed sometimes they were. And I do know, I've heard him talk. The thing I've heard Lusker talk the most about was how the white people in that area up there took an interest in him, particularly women up there, because he was bright and a good student at things, and they helped him get through school and everything.
You mentioned William Henry Jones a moment ago. I believe he was adjutant general at one time, was he not?
Under Slim Sampson.
That would have been in 1927
Mm-hmm.
and to 31.
He was course, Sampson was the only Republican that had in there for a while. And, of course, the Joneses were all Republicans. And he was made adjutant general. Of course, he had been an officer now during World War I, even though I think he'd enlisted as an enlisted man when they went to Mexico, but he'd been an officer in World War I. That became the 38th Division, incidentally. Those units that went from Bowling Green, I think probably the 149th Infantry of the 38th Division. And anyway, he was chosen to be the adjutant general of the state of Kentucky. And I know a story that I know about him. I have a copy of this picture that William Henry gave me one time. In I believe, about 31, 32, the Boy Scouts in this state, they decided to have a Kentucky State camp-corral, and they wanted to go to Frankfort. And that was, Dr. Billy Bryant, Dr. Lewis Dickinson, and I don't know, Addis Britt might have been the leader then. I forget. But anyway, there were several of them that went. And they didn't have any equipment much. And the National Guard, through William Henry Jones, provided tents and things for a lot of them. And I know they had these, you remember the big old deep Japan bake pans the Army used to have, you know? Well, they gave them, and they camped on the lawn of the Capitol there, and they would fill those full of sand and build their fires on top of that sand so they wouldn't hurt the lawn there. And William Henry, by the way, was the man who brought the first scouting to Glasgow. In 1912, they had friends in Louisville, and he had never seen a football game. And Mayle, I think, was playing Manual. And so these friends invited him to come up and spend the weekend with them and go to this football game. And he got up there, and they were having a big scout rally in Louisville. And he went to it, and Uncle Dan Beard, who was the National Scout Commissioner, was there, and he got to meet him. And so he decided, someone told him that you could get, I think, a pair of boots free if you got a scout troop started. So he came back here, and he went to the Christian church then, which was on the square, and he started talking to the boys up there about being scouts. And the preacher up there one day stopped him as they went out of the church and said, I understand you're interested in getting a Boy Scout troop started. And he said, yes, he was. He said, I'll be your scoutmaster. And so that became the first Boy Scout troop. People like him and Dick Garnett, and I've got a list of them over there. They're all gone. But anyway, they formed the scout troop, and I thought this was interesting because years later, when they had this Kentucky State camp-corral, here was the adjutant general who started out more or less because of Uncle Dan Beard. They were there shaking hands, you know. He was a public-spirited person. All the Joneses were. The Republicans was a paper that we'd never have another one like, because if your subscription ran out, they just kept sending it to you. They figured you'd come in and pay someday, and most people, believe it or not, did. They didn't charge much anyway. I've always been told that some of the commentators on whatever network that Julian Goodman was on, he'd get the Glasgow Republican in the mail, you know, and the day it came in, they'd come in, wanted to read it because they wanted to read Lucy's letter, and they couldn't believe that people down here, you know, sent things like that in.
Well, of course, there was a great rival between the Joneses, which had the Republican, and the Richardsons,
yes, there
which
was.
had the Glasgow Times. And I understand, though, that it was a very friendly rivalry.
It was a friendly rivalry. They were at each other's throats. They couldn't wait for one of them to do something wrong, or something that they could get on him, you know. But that was the way it was. And you know, Glasgow then, we still had trees in front of the Glasgow Times, which is up there. I don't know what's in that building now, but anyway. Yeah, they were all, Joe Richland was a character, and so was William Henry Jones Jr., and they were all characters, and I'm glad I grew up around them in this town, because we had some people like Jim Clayton, who was the mayor. I always thought a lot of Jim Clayton, and people like Gordon Brown, and Bill McEwen, you know, was the first person to bring hamburgers to Glasgow. He introduced hamburgers to Glasgow, and I used to tell him that he's going to have to come out of retirement and get back to work, because if he didn't, McDonald's was going to catch up with him, you know. And he and Gordon were good friends, but they'd have a fuss just about once a week, and he'd tell him to come around and get his blank ice cream machine out of there, and then when Gordon would come and get it, he'd call him up and wonder where his ice cream machine was and get it back up there.
Well, you know the story, I'm sure, about this happened after I came to Glasgow, about the Grayson Yancey having the man with the spring wagon unload a load of wood in the restaurant?
Yeah. Told he was a little crazy, didn't it? Not to pay attention to him when he unloaded, just go ahead and unload it.
Well, yeah, he told him that, told McEwen, Grayson Yancey told the man that he bought the wood from that his name was Bill McEwen and that he owned the restaurant. And, of course, Bill was down there operating it, and he says, when you unload that wood in there alongside the wall, he says, that's where I want it. He says, this man that's managing is going to come out there and really raise the roof with you about it. And he says, you just pay no attention to him. You just go on and unload the wood. And sure enough, that's what happened. And Bill had an awful time getting the man to stop to bringing in the wood.
I bet that had some colorful things to say, too. Grayson Yancey, you know, was another character. Grayson was drafted in World War II. He was passed in his 40s. And, of course, they used to, they aggravated him because he was an older man. And one of the things they would do was when he got up to leave the table to go get a glass of water or a cup of water or a cup of coffee, you know, they'd grab the guys at the table would steal his food. And so they said one day he just sat down and put his plate down and reached up and took out his upper and lower plate and laid them on top of his food. And that was the last time anybody ever bothered him.
We'll discuss one other thing here briefly, and that's the era of the medicine men. I understand Glasgow had one or more of its own. What can you tell about the medicine men?
The most famous man was Dakota Jack Pursley. He actually went out west. But way up until after World War II, we had medicine men coming into Glasgow. And they usually got in that lot on the other side of Tubby Grissom's office, between it and the Rock House. And they sold snake oil and stuff like that. And had all kind of little things to draw you in, you know. And I don't know what that stuff was. It wasn't much of anything, I don't think. But Dakota Jack was quite famous. He did go west. He went out into the Dakotas and everything. Several of those Presleys did that. They went west, you know. And Jack, he came back to this country here and was pretty well known for his medicine shows.
Well, how did he get his crowd? What
Oh, they do stuff like
the crowd?
They do stuff like they could crack a whip, or they'd. I know. I remember one of them here. He had a bandage on his hand, and there was a knife sticking, or it appeared to be a knife sticking through his hand, you know. And things like that would draw him in, you know. And then there wasn't much to do for entertainment then as there is now. And people together down there, you know, and they'd sell snake oil. I remember snake oil was one of the things they sold a lot of. But they would just cure anything, you know. They'd really take care of you. That, and of course we had street preachers too. That was another big entertainment we had in those days.
Well, as I have heard and understood, that Doc Nunn started out as a medicine man.
He might very well have. When I first remember him, he was in already in the parts business, you know. It was Nunn and Cassidy. And they were up on the square, on the south side of the square. And I don't know, that's where he got his name, Doc. I don't know. I know he was in the First World War, I remember that. And they lived down the street from me. And Mater, his son, he was sort of the hero of Cleveland Avenue. He organized the Cleveland Avenue Indians, and we had such famous people in there. Everett Kilgore, who later on killed 2 people in Bowling Green. And in that team, we had some real people that we used to play. We'd play the Gas House Gang, which was from South Green Street, and they had such people as Ham Fat High.